Hello. And today I wanted to try to talk a little bit about Brian Wilson. And I say try because it's going to be really hard to put what his work meant to me and what it did for me into like coherent words. But I'm going to try. Um, so, as of this recording, Brian Wilson uh, passed away a few days ago. He was 82, I believe. He had been suffering with dementia as well as having mental health struggles, at times very severe mental health struggles for his entire life, or at least since a very young age. And even before some of those mental health issues manifested in full, he did have very abusive childhood. His father was not a nice guy, um, and he suffered a lot of personal hardship in his life. The loss of his brothers, Carl and Dennis, well before their time, and also the abuse of his therapist Eugene Landy, who really ruined about a solid decade, if not more, of his life by by over medicating him, by forcing him to work at times where his mental headspace was just not there, and just in general being very abusive and cruel emotionally. Um, Very restrictive about what Brian was able to do or not do on a daily basis. But Brian's life over the last couple of decades got a lot better. He got married um, to this woman, Melinda, uh, who helped him, get back on tour, get out on the road. And he found this great backing band with the Wondermints, people who really loved his art and supported him. Um, and he seemed, he still struggled a lot with mental health stuff, with physical stuff, but he seemed in a much better place, a much more supportive place with his family and the band, and he seemed to be doing all right until the past couple of years. He seemed to have, if not moved beyond a lot of these things, kind of learned to live with them and found people who could help him thrive, and that was really wonderful to see. Uh, but I'll talk about a little bit about my relationship with his music. For about the first, God, I don't know, the first 30 years of my life, I thought the music of the Beach Boys was really stupid and really corny. Um, and I'd have thought it was like dumb music for jocks. I don't know. Like I would hear their songs about surfing and girls and being true to your school and cars and shit, and it's just like, okay, I'm sure it's good, but it's just not for me. It's not my kind of thing, you know. Um, and I felt that way for an incredibly long time, and there were little indications that maybe there was something I was missing, like, for example, I saw the film Love and Mercy, the Brian Wilson biopic, and I wasn't even really interested in that movie because of Brian's work. It's just because I knew the premise that Paul Dano and John Cusack, who are both actors I really like, were playing the same guy, in different phases of his life. And I was like, how's that going to work? Those guys are nothing alike. So I saw it out of curiosity, and I was like quite moved by the movie. But, at the end of the day, I was still like, he was an interesting guy, but I still feel the same way about the music. I feel like the music isn't really for me. And then I ended up seeing the cover of Surf's Up and was really kind of fascinated by it. I'll put it up over here. Just the fact that a Beach Boys album called Surf's Up would have a cover like this. It seemed so strange and almost like kind of like a meta joke. And then I listened to the song, and it was like this gorgeous piano ballad, and I was very confused. And I was just like, maybe there is something more going on here, but I chose not to engage with it. Even if I liked that particular song, I was like, he wrote one good song. It's still all those corny songs about car racing and going down to the malt shop and shit. I was just like, yeah, no thanks. But then, we cut a few years to the whole COVID situation, where people are stuck at home, and the just the minutiae of their daily lives, the stuff that people just took for granted, as these are things that are always going to be present in my life, were being taken away. It didn't seem so certain anymore. And it was a time for a lot of people, and for me, of like real anxiety and paranoia and sadness. Um, so it was not really in a good headspace. And I saw on YouTube, because I was spending most of the day just like watching YouTube videos trying to forget about my current situation. I saw this video for a live version of the Smile album, Brian performing the entire Smile album. Um, and just a real brief thing about Smile, if you don't know about it, was Smile was originally Brian's follow up and the Beach Boys follow up to Pet Sounds. Pet Sounds had been this really, seminal, artistically majestic album, but it had received kind of some mixed reviews at the time. But the Beatles were super into it. They kind of responded to Pet Sounds with Sgt. Pepper, just like Brian had responded to Revolver with Pet Sounds. They'd been going back and forth for a while. If I say things that are wrong in this video, I'm just going off the cuff. So, but yeah, Brian set to work on this great new concept album. He enlisted the help of this brilliant lyricist and arranger named Van Dyke Parks, who previous to that and who after that went on to do a ton of cool production work and studio musician work, and worked with all kinds of really interesting people, from producing like the first Randy Newman album to co-producing Yeast by Joanna Newsom. Just all kinds of really crazy and fascinating career. And so he and Brian were working on this together. Van Dyke was doing the lyrics, Brian was doing the music. But they were collaborating and working together on the overall shape of it. And it was remarkable music. It was so creative and complex and funny and moving and strange, and at the same time so carefully honed and crafted. It's incredible. And you can see, in all of these videos above my desk here, I have a poster for Smile. This is the album artwork for Smile when the album was originally supposed to come out at the end of the 60s. And yeah, the Beach Boys came back from tour because at that point Brian, had kind of had his breakdown on a plane and had convinced them, like, I don't want to go out on tour. Take Glenn Campbell to replace me on bass, and I'm going to stay here so I don't have emotional breakdowns on planes. I'm going to stay here, and just work on refining my craft and work on our music. And then you guys come back from tour and we'll cut the record. And so Brian is in the studio working with these remarkable studio musicians called the Wrecking Crew. And, as Brian was getting more advanced in his musical thinking, he was relying on these more adept musicians. Like the Beach Boys themselves were fine musicians, but with the Wrecking Crew, much like with Brian's later backing band, the Wonderments, he had like the muscle to try all of his crazy ideas, and more often than not to have them work exceedingly well. But yeah, the Beach Boys got back from tour and they weren't really feeling the material. Famously, Mike Love, who is kind of the most vilified character in the Beach Boys story, and for good reason in some ways. He got in this, like big fight with Van Dyke Parks about one of the lyrics in this incredible song, Cabin Essence. I think it was like over and over, the crow cries, uncover the cornfield. And Mike Love kept being like, is this about drugs? Is this about hard drugs? And Van Dyke would be like, I don't know what it's about. It's like poetry. And I think it sounds cool. I like the rhythm of it. And Mike was like, yeah, but is it about fucking drugs? To the point where like Van Dyke got so frustrated that he abandoned the project. And Van Dyke leaving the project, coupled with the band not really feeling it, coupled with Brian, it was like starting to take shape. But the album had like all of these moving parts and all of these distinct little sections that had to be threaded together, and it was just very overwhelming. And the record company wanted a new album, and all of these pressures combining on Brian basically caused him to mentally collapse and abandon the project. And then they recorded like a goofy marijuana fueled version of it just at Brian's house called Smiley Smile. Uh, just as kind of, I think, a nice gesture of friendship to Brian, just like a sorry we broke your brain. Let's just come over to your house and record a fun album kind of thing. And Smiley Smile, I should really like it because it's really weird and fun and has like odd instrumentation, and it does have a cool vibe, that album. But every time I listen to that album, it just makes me sad because I think about, what it should have been, what it could have been, that it was this like goofy little fun record, but it could have been this like career defining masterpiece. And then eventually in like the early 2000s, Brian had enough support in his home life with Melinda and his kids, and with this great new backing band he'd found, who were very versatile and who knew his works inside and out. He found the support to actually go and finish Smile, and to re-enlist Van Dyke Parks to write the missing lyrics, and and to finish it and to take it out on tour and to perform it live to just like rapturous applause, and to eventually record it in a record that is my favorite album of all time. And the reasons why it's my favorite album of all time, I mean, has to start with the music, which I've already praised so much. It's so creative and so original. Nothing else sounds like it, and it's so accomplished. In terms of the way that it's orchestrated, and all of that. But it's beyond that. It's just it's such a singular vision, so beautifully realized, and it's impressive, but it's not just music that's supposed to be like shock and awe. It's like very entertaining and very emotional as well. It kind of has everything that I want in a record. But I also love it that much because I know what Brian went through to make it and what a huge relief to him it was to finish it and to perform it in front of people and to see them respond so positively. It really was this huge, like albatross he'd been carrying around, and getting to finish Smile was such a tremendous personal victory for him. It had been, like 40 years since he tried to finish Smile, and he finally did it. And it was great. There are people who have complaints about the album and the way it's produced and all of this, but I just love it. And all I hear when I listen to it is just like victory and elation, you know? But the first time I heard it, was during COVID. I was in this really bad headspace, so it's not feeling good at all. And I saw the live version of Smile in my recommended videos. And at this point, I still thought the Beach Boys were super dumb. But, I thought back to what I knew about Brian. I thought about Surf's Up, which was on this record, was originally intended for this record. And I thought about, how intrigued that song had made me. Like, I didn't even know they had stuff like that in their repertoire. And I began to think about Love and Mercy and everything that he went through with Dr. Landy, and trying to be with Melinda and trying to break out of this little tiny box they'd put him in. Um, and also trying to regain his passion for art. Because Dr. Landy would try to force him to write songs so that he could make money off it, but Brian was not in a headspace where he could really make the kind of music he wanted to make. So, knowing all that, I was just like, hey, I didn't even know that he ever finished this. I should at least, listen to it just out of curiosity. And it just blew me away so much that first watch. Like, I was really floored by it. And at the end of it, after this huge, long, complicated, beautifully performed thing with all these songs like Heroes and Villains and Cabin Essence and Surf's Up and Vegetables, like all of these songs with all of these moving parts and these incredible little flourishes, and just the amazing musicianship of this backing band to like adapt to all of it as it's continuing to spiral out. And at the end of it, he got to Good Vibrations, which is a song I know. It's a song that pretty much everybody knows. I'd heard it on the radio many times, but hearing it in this new context, that they just gone through this hugely complicated thing, and now they were coming into the song they've performed hundreds, thousands of times, that just everybody in that room knew and loved. It just felt like this immense just victory lap, and it felt so joyous. And when the song ended, I could see it on Brian's face. I could see the happiness in that moment and the relief as everybody was applauding, and just this overwhelming feeling that just like holy shit, you did it. you know you got through all this adversity and you did it, and you made something incredible. And I watched it, and I felt happy in a in a in a way after watching it, in a way that I hadn't felt in quite a long time, like even pre-pandemic. I hadn't felt that kind of joy in a while, and so I kept watching it, and it kept showing up in my recommended videos because I kept watching it. And so it just basically created this endless loop where sometimes I was watching it every day, you know, for a few weeks there. Um, I must have watched it, 50 times during the pandemic, maybe more, probably more. And at a certain point, I was just like, the guy who created this, you know, I know that the Beach Boys are dumb and corny, but if the guy was able to play such a huge role in creating this music, I need to hear everything else he ever did. And I'll suffer through the stupid stuff, but chances are there's going to be some other really wonderful, really powerful stuff in there. And I just have to find it. So I started at the beginning. I started with the first Beach Boys record with Surfin' Safari, and I just worked my way through all the Beach Boys records, all the Brian Wilson solo records. And at first, I was just like, yeah, I was right. This music is corny and stupid, but, I can appreciate some of it has cool arrangements, some of it has cool harmonies. I like the way some of it sounds sonically. It's just kind of stupid and corny. And the more I listened to it, the more I began to appreciate it more and more until I got to this album today. That was just this quantum leap in terms of quality and just the complexity of the songwriting, both musically and lyrically. And I saw, that Mike Love, who was a guy who I'd previously dismissed as being a jerk and a cornball, that he had helped write all of these really intense and emotional and artistic songs. And, I, I began to, at first, I was just like, I'm here for Brian and I'll put up with everybody else's shit. But the longer I listened to it, the more I began to appreciate everyone in that band for what they brought to it. And we'll never know what it would have been like if Brian Wilson hadn't had these people collaborating with him who largely dictated, you know, well, maybe not dictated the direction of these projects, but strongly influenced the direction of these projects. Brian, he wrote very few songs on his own. He always liked to have a collaborator, whether it's Mike Love or Tony Asher on Pet Sounds or Van Dyke Parks on Smile, or later like Andy Paley and Joe Thomas. He always liked to have somebody, to like hash it out with. Um, and we'll never know what it would have been like if Brian's vision hadn't been compromised at all and he had written every song by himself. But even though Mike Love, did a lot of stuff later on in the group, with like their 80s stuff and with Summer and fucking Paradise and all of this, a lot of work that I would say is not very good. I do think his effect on Brian, his collaborations with Brian, were a net positive. They co-wrote a lot of great songs together. Um, and the more I began listening to this, it was like today was the first time where I was just like, okay, there is something here. Going through all of this music was justified. This is incredible. And then from there on, I kept finding more and more and more incredible music from all the stages of Brian's career. And I just became more and more blown away by him as an artist, but also just him as a person. I would, learn as much as I could about him from interviews, from reading things, including this book, which is beautiful. This autobiography that he co-wrote with a journalist named Ben Greenman. And the way this reads, having watched a lot of interviews with Brian, is it reads like, Brian kind of spoke to Ben or spoken to a typewriter. I mean, a tape machine, and like told all these stories, and then Ben wrote them down and just put them in a book because it very much reads like Brian talks, where it's like kind of disarmingly simple language, conveying very complicated stuff. and it just kind of jumps around the way his brain would kind of jump around from topic to topic. It's not at all linear. It just, I can understand if you're not kind of familiar with the way Brian Wilson thinks, that it might be kind of annoying to read. But as a guy who loves the way that Brian Wilson um, thinks or thought, I have to sadly say thought now. Um, I really loved this and was really moved by it. And just the more that I learned about Brian, the more that I heard, the more that I learned about his life, the more impressed and moved I was by everything that he went through and was able to overcome. And, I related to Brian in a lot of ways. I mean, we're very different in a lot of ways. I am not a creative genius. I have also never done hard drugs. Um, so that's different. Um, but there are a lot of similarities. Brian, he had trouble establishing boundaries, which is something I've always had trouble with. In a lot of ways, he was like a people pleaser and could let people take advantage of him at times. He struggled with addiction. He struggled with emotional eating, which is, stuff that I've dealt with, continue to deal with. And he was pretty antisocial. He liked to, stay in bed a lot, stay inside a lot, kind of have people come to him. Um, and this is all stuff that I related to in one way or another, especially during this COVID time where I wasn't living the way that I wanted to live. I was living this very restrained, pent up life. And so the parts of Brian's life where he was under Dr. Landy's supervision, and he basically can't go outside and can't see people and can't live the life he wants to live. I really related to it in that moment, and I, that's part of why watching Smile hit me so hard. Just because I related so much to some of Brian's struggles and what he'd been through, and just the fact that he wasn't able to move past this stuff, because you can't completely move past stuff like that. But the fact that he was able to reach the other side and to finish Smile and to get out of that situation with Dr. Landy and to get his health under control and to just make this better life for himself through sheer force of will and creativity, and also through accepting help from people who genuinely wanted to help him and not just take advantage of him. It was so beautiful and inspiring to me. And Smile, when I listen to it, a big part of the reason it's my favorite album of all time is that I hear all of that in it. When I listen to it, I hear that strife that he went through and everything that he had to move past over that 40 years. And just the joy of that record is like a culmination of all of that sadness and difficulty. So it moves me like no other album does. And this is why I think that death of the author thing is like bullshit, that you should just experience art in and of itself. For me, the context of this record lends it so much more power and importance and just enhances it so much. And I wouldn't trade knowing that context for anything. It's taught me things, about myself. It's taught me important lessons that have made my life better. And I think I used to be uh, a pretty negative person, a pretty cynical person in a lot of ways, and I've tried to get better at that over the years, and I think I've made, to give myself credit, I think I made a lot of progress on that. But just the fact that I not only, it wasn't that I gave a shit, didn't give a shit about the Beach Boys. It was that I actively disliked the Beach Boys and thought the Beach Boys were like the dumbest, corniest shit out there. And so the fact that I had misjudged them to that degree, or that I had changed that much, and the fact that this music that I had not only dismissed as like but like outright, I would never enjoy that in a million years. The fact that this was now rapidly becoming my favorite music on earth was like a pretty significant change in my life. It's like it was the same thing as COVID. It was this stuff you take for granted that's like never gonna change. It can change in an instant. In this case, it was a positive thing. In the case of COVID, it was a very, very negative thing. But it just made me think. What other people, what other works of art have I underestimated or unfairly dismissed? And by the way, I'm not saying that if you don't like the Beach Boys, you're like a cynical jerk. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it was important for me to acknowledge and to be okay with, okay, this is what my brain is doing. This is the way I really feel now. And to just go with it and embrace it and let myself become obsessed with it, quite frankly. Um, and the more I learned to, love this music, I could feel myself opening up to other possibilities and trying out other things. For example, I kept reading about how Brian Wilson and Paul McCartney, there was like this mutual respect there, and even this kind of a bit of artistic rivalry there. And believe it or not, like a lot of people when they're young, they're just like, it's like Beatles and Beach Boys, that's like such like fundamental building blocks in like a music lover's arsenal. But it's just like, for me, I was like a mild Beatles fan, and a Beach Boys hater, like straight up. Um, and my main problem with the Beatles was Paul McCartney. That I thought Paul McCartney's stuff was like really cutesy and lame. And so just reading this stuff, I was like, well, maybe if I love Brian's stuff now, maybe I'll love Paul McCartney's stuff now too. Now that I'm open to this, and I did, and it blew me away. And suddenly I was like a 31, 32 year old going like, hey, did you know the fucking Beatles are good? Did you know that the Beatles and the Beach Boys are like two of the best rock bands of their era? And everybody was just like, yeah, we fucking know. But I didn't know. And it was a huge revelation for me. And it was, then I was just like, I was willing to try anything. I was just like, what about the fucking Monkees? Like, the only band I used to think was cornier and lamer than the Beach Boys were the Monkees. And so I started listening to the Monkees, and I was like, the Monkees have some fucking great stuff too. I got obsessed with that song "Me and Magdalena" that they did on like their comeback album in like the 2000s, and it was just, then you go back and you hear stuff like, Headquarters and Head and all of these really cool, strange records, and you're like, wow, there was something really cool here. So it was important for me. It was important for me to go through that. And it changed the way I think in a lot of fundamental ways. It changed the way I think about art. It changed the way I go through life. It was it was about being open minded and opening myself up to just feeling the way I felt and not trying to feel some other way or think some other way, just to embrace what was actually happening in my brain, you know? And Brian played an integral role in that for me. He radically changed my life, and he gave me direction and comfort in a moment where I was feeling my lowest, where I was almost feeling like hopeless, you know. And as the more I loved the music, I loved him as a guy. I thought he was like an endlessly fascinating person, and everything he'd gone through, everything he was dealing with. If you watch him in interviews, he's very curt. He doesn't say very much. Um, and it's because in his head, all of this stuff is like battling each other. He's still got all of this weight that he has to drag around. And the fact that he was able to do that and endure into, be the last man standing in his family and still produce beautiful art. No other artist inspires me and moves me more than Brian Wilson. And in fact, back when I became just really enraptured with his art, I began writing this thing, like this piece of long form criticism, where I was going through every album and talking about not only the art, but how I thought it related to Brian's life and how I related it to my life. And it ended up being like 270 pages and like 170,000 words or something. And I didn't finish it because quite frankly, the fire went out, and I love the music. I still love the music, but that passion that had propelled me to get all of that done, it kind of died down a little bit. And I was like, okay, after months and months and months of just being obsessed with Brian Wilson and just listening to like only Brian Wilson and like some Paul McCartney and Paul Simon, by the way, another guy who I used to think was kind of lame, who I was just like, did you know Paul Simon is fucking incredible? And everybody was just like, yeah, I know. you know um so I was willing to branch out again and listen to some new music and go back to stuff I'd missed and all of this, basically to say that I didn't finish this. And there was also a part of me in the back of my head where I was just like, I know that when I finish this fucking piece of writing, that Brian's gonna die. It was like those people who are like, I don't want to watch the game because if I watch the game, they're gonna lose. It was like that for me. Like, I knew it was irrational and stupid and it made no sense, but I was just like, I know the second I press period on that final sentence, I'm gonna hear that he's died. Um, and so that obviously didn't happen. Brian has so sadly passed away now, and I still haven't finished this. Um, so I think that's going to free me up to be able to do it once it stops being so emotionally draining to listen to his music. Like some time will have to pass, but I am feeling energized to finish this now. In tribute to him, whether it ends up leading to anything or not. And I do want to read. You can skip this part if you want, but I do want to read a little bit of what I wrote. Um, so the point of this was not only to respond to his art, but to talk about why I related to him and his life so strongly, and to try to find answers about his art and answers for the stuff that I was dealing with in my own life. So this is me talking about a song that he wrote called Saturday Morning in the City, which is basically a song about, it's like a Carpe Diem song. It's like you got to get up and enjoy the day and get out there and have some fun. And basically what he settles on is, let's go to the grocery store and then let's sit in a chair. And if a neighbor wants to come by and sit in a chair too, that's great. They can sit in a chair with us and we can talk. And so this was kind of just me responding to this song and bringing in what I learned from his autobiography, which is once again beautiful. I couldn't recommend this enough. And kind of talking about myself a little bit too. So I think this will illustrate how much I related to Brian and how much his art meant to me. So I'm just going to read. There's like a couple pages, so sorry. Um, but okay, yeah. So this is about Saturday morning in the city. Brian begins his beautiful autobiography, I Am Brian Wilson, by, you know what? I gotta, my throat is scratchy. I gotta drink something. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm back. Got this diet birch beer at the store. This is good. Oh god. All right. Let's see. Brian begins his beautiful autobiography, I Am Brian Wilson, by talking about his chair. He speaks about getting up in the morning, how it's harder to get out of bed in the winter. I used to have real trouble getting up in the winter, he says, and even when I did, I might stay in bed for hours. These days, it's easier to start the day, no matter what the season. Regardless of the time, Brian makes his way downstairs and immediately sits down in his chair. For me, it's my love seat. From the second I get out of bed, I cannot wait to sit in this love seat with my dog curled up by my side. Whenever I have to leave for non fun reasons, for work or errands, I spend the whole day anticipating the moment when I can return to my love seat. It's not even that comfortable, but it's the place I feel most at ease. Like my love seat, Brian's chair is old and beat up. He's had it forever. It's been reupholstered multiple times. Another thing both of our pieces of beloved furniture share in common is that they face the TV. Brian will watch his game shows, his early morning news, his baseball games. I mostly watch sandwich videos and sitcoms I've seen 1,000 times, but Brian can see more than that from his chair. He can see the kitchen and into the backyard. He says that you can see the whole of Los Angeles from back there along the expansive Benedict Canyon if you go and look. Brian has a phone next to his chair, as you'd expect, but he doesn't dwell on that. He says that Melinda mostly leaves him to his thoughts in the mornings, but that sometimes she'll eventually ask him what's wrong, what he's thinking. Sometimes he'll tell her that he misses his brothers, that he wants to know where they are and why they were taken away. On other days, he still hears scary voices after all these years and medications and radical therapies. Melinda's there to put all of that into perspective, to remind him that the voices aren't real and that his brothers have been gone for a long time. He says that when she's not there, he tries to imagine what she'd say. Brian loves his chair. It's where he goes to unwind, to get perspective, to relax. But the chair doesn't spare him from the torments of his mind. That's one of Brian's things, one of mine as well. I'm sure a lot of you can relate. The things that comfort us can also be the things that hurt us. Brian has social anxiety, so it'd be easier to just stay inside. But if he stays inside all the time, he gains weight. He's tempted by drugs and alcohol. He's emotionally dependent on the affections of others. Brian loves his chair, but he knows he needs to leave it sometimes to go get breakfast, to take a walk, to watch his son play basketball. His life can't all be comfort because comfort can kill. That's one of the things that Melinda helps him with, the balance he struggles to maintain. In other words, he's got to get his poor old body to move, which is a quote of his from a B-side to the Brian Wilson by Brian Wilson record. I've thought a lot about that particular song lately. I'm reticent to exercise. All of my passions, watching movies, writing stories, listening to music, can be accomplished sitting down. And whenever I'm standing, I'm eagerly anticipating the next moment I get to sit. But Brian's right. Whether you want to or not, you need to force yourself to move. We all want our lives to be pleasurable, but sometimes life has to suck. Sometimes you need to go for a walk, even though you'd rather watch season 2 of Community for the 475th time. Sometimes, even though some mac and cheese would really put your mind at ease, you have to eat a big old bowl of salad. If you don't do that, you'll end up like me. And let me just say, I know this is very complainy, uh, but reading this, you know, there were a lot of things in here I still relate to and still have trouble with, but I've moved on so much from the person who wrote this. Like, I feel so much better on a daily basis, and like better about myself and better about my situation, and my health, while still far from where I want it to be, has improved. I'm able to get around easier and not constantly be completely exhausted. And so reading this is actually, it's a bummer, but it's really kind of a nice reminder that I have made some progress. But I continue. You'll end up like me. You'll be what Brian used to be, and what he's figured out how to move beyond. When you get horribly out of shape, getting yourself to move becomes a lot harder. It shifts from being simple laziness into a growing realization that moving is hard now. But the harder it is to move, to go for a walk, to get out of that chair, the more you need to do it, and the more you'll wish you did it earlier. As Brian says, I always remember to take a walk. This is all a very long winded way of saying that I think Saturday Morning in the City is basically a song about the chair. It's about finding the will to move, to do something, to enrich your life. Whether or not our protagonist is ultimately successful is left unresolved, and I don't think his chances are looking too good. But if he can't manage to get out of the chair again today, there's always tomorrow. There's always next Saturday. And as mixed as I am on the track's whole demented carnival aesthetic, I do so love that swell near the end as Brian triumphantly sings, "So glad I got you out of bed now. Weekends are so good for your head now." Getting out of bed alone is a triumph for Brian, and that's nothing to scoff at. He spent years barely moving from his bed, as we know. The fact that he can leave his bed freely now, that he can clean himself up, hop in his car, and drive down to the diner for a breakfast of fruit and veggie patties, is a beautiful thing. He doesn't take this for granted, and neither should we. In My Room has made me cry several dozen times, and for good reason. It held a tremendous amount of meaning when Brian originally wrote it, but it gained so much resonance in the years since. Brian's room used to be a refuge from his abusive father, but he came to rely on it too much. Eventually, he found himself unable to leave. That's when this hugely positive force in Brian's life, this place he could go to find solace, transformed into something so much darker. If Brian didn't have support, people to pull him out of there, then he'd likely still be in his room today, getting fatter and weirder and smellier and dirtier. Instead, he's going out for a drive or a walk. He starts the day in the chair. He probably ends up there as well, but he's found the strength to leave it, to get on stage and sing songs, to be a member of the human race. Saturday Morning in the City makes me think of all that and so much more. It reminds me that what you are is often such a short distance from where you want to be, even if the road between them seems endless. Love the chair, appreciate the chair, dream of the chair, but know that you must also leave the chair. The chair doesn't love you. It doesn't want what's best for you. It doesn't keep the voices out or the memories away. You can't depend on it to keep you happy. You have to depend on yourself. Yeah, so that was a little thing I wrote about, and I wrote that just about one song in Brian's discography, and I read about half of what I wrote for that particular song. So maybe that illustrates for you how much of an impact his art made on me, and how much I relate to it, and how much I relate to him, and how inspired by him and moved by him and his work that I am. And I think a lot of fans of Brian, because he's been through so much hardship, because he's been taken advantage of by so many people, we felt protective of him. And I know that's weird, but everybody was always doubting Melinda's intentions and stuff, and is she forcing him to go out on tour? Is she putting auto tune mics on the mic stand before the shows and all of this? And I think Melinda, who passed away herself pretty recently, was a hugely positive force in Brian's life, because the stuff that Dr. Landy, his abusive therapist, was getting Brian to do was stuff that Brian didn't want to do. And I think Melinda saw that, okay, this guy wants to spend all day in the chair. He wants to comfort himself so that he doesn't have to deal with the realities of his life. But he needs to go out on tour. He needs to make music, because ultimately, this is the stuff that matters to him. This is the stuff that he's supposed to be doing. And it's the stuff that brings him real joy, not necessarily momentary joy, not momentary comfort, but lasting joy. And so, if she forced him to go out on tour, she's basically providing him with the support he needs and the push he needs to get out there and to play his music for these people who loved him and who cheered for him and who illustrated for him how important his work was to so many millions of people. And I'm not going to even talk about like his artistic influence and how important he was to popular music, because tons of other people are doing that. And ultimately there are lots of people who are very important to popular music who I'm not necessarily super into their art. That doesn't that matters to me historically, but that doesn't matter to me in terms of my level of appreciation and enjoyment. I love this music, and I think Brian was a fascinating guy and a brilliant guy and a wonderful musician, a wonderful artist, and a hugely inspirational figure. And he changed my life, and that's not like a special thing. Like, he changed so many people's lives, and so many people like me have turned to his art for comfort and to figure shit out and to learn from him and to study him and what made him so special. And I've really tried hard to put into words what he meant to me, as an artist and a guy, and why I loved and continue to love his art so much. And I think there's a lot I should have said that I probably didn't say, and I'll watch this later and I'll be like, oh, I should have said this and that and all this. But the truth is, I can never put it into words. It's beyond words. It's emotional, and you can try to sum up emotions with words, but when they're deep and they're complicated and they're very important to you, it's, at a certain point, it's going to be an exercise in futility to sum that up with something as conventional as language. So I will just say, love the guy, love his art, love what he did for my brain. And, in the middle of this really unfortunate chapter in my life, I will always treasure, that time I spent with Smile and with his art, and that first big Brian Wilson rabbit hole I fell down. That was incredibly important to me. And I'll look back on it as something that was important to me and powerful, and something that, quite frankly, made me a better person. So, thank you, Brian.